there, and welcome back to another episode of Life According to Paolo. But today, we're going to get someone else's view on life. And as you know, I love to focus on topics, and today's topic is around storytelling. Today, I'll be your host. My name is Paolo Salmi, aka the Pint Adventurer. I'm an author, public speaker, mentor, and a coach, and also Abuelo's Naito. So welcome to the stage.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.
Hang on. So first of all, just so the viewers, listeners, and watchers know who you are, just like you to introduce yourself and just tell them what you do and why you do it.
Sure. I'm the Southern California version of Paolo. I grew up in the 60s and had a wonderful life, and I was curious and all of that. And I ended up going into the corporate business world. That was kind of my career as I grew up. And there came a point when I looked deeply at myself. There seemed to be some dissatisfaction about where I was in life, and so I began a spiritual journey that coincided with my career journey and family journey and all the rest of it. And as a result I spent a lot of time in India. I came back to the corporate world and began to teach a lot of spiritually based principles in the leadership arena. That's where those things tend to belong. And leadership in the corporate world is the place for any kind of new thing that's happening. So it's a neat place to do things. And so probably the main thing is I'm pretty well known as a story person. I developed something called story theory, and that is a way back to what we call our rooted authenticity, as I put it. And that's a major part of the spiritual journey. It's also incredibly powerful in the corporate world. What people don't understand is the spiritual journey actually is the leadership journey. So it's the same thing. So wherever story is powerful, it's powerful, and there are reasons that it is. And so that's probably what we'll talk a little bit about today, I assume. But that's what I'm known for, I think.
Yeah, definitely, because I've been running your spiritual MBA course. And which is every week, and we literally just, I think every 2 weeks, and then every week we just meet up. It's absolutely amazing because, as you said, you developed like something around storytelling, which is actually what we're going to be focusing on around today. So first of all, whoever's watching may be wondering, storytelling, they may be thinking of the little three pigs. Could you explain a bit more context around what storytelling is to you?
Sure. I think in a way, and this is one of my, and I haven't found the magic potion yet, but storytelling doesn't really do service to how story actually lives in our life. We call ourselves storytellers as though the telling is what's important. And actually what's important is how does the story live in our life? Because all of us, if we look at our identity, if we look at what we do every day, mentally we render all of that into stories. If Paolo goes, hey, Abuelo, what did you do yesterday? What do I tell you? Oh, I did this and I did that. I render a story, right? I tell you, it may be boring, but it's a story. And who knows what I did yesterday, but likely boring. And so the bottom line is that what people don't see is that the very nature of how you and I are as humans, intellectually and cognitively, and those are kind of funny words, all that means is from a mind standpoint, that we naturally extract story. We do that from the time where we start with language and we're little children. So that's the most powerful place that we have in us is that rooted story. It's moving from nothingness into story. That's kind of that. Joseph Campbell was very famous for talking about that particular little piece of the journey. Then, of course, people begin to use story and they become storytellers. And so so when I'm working with it, in our world today, we actually believe that maybe spreadsheets and theories and concepts and all these things that actually come from story are more important than story, and that story is kind of this thing we did as kids, but it's not intellectually important enough, um, to actually call the most powerful and basic birthright that we have. So that's kind of the world. That's the mission typically I'm on, is to get people to see that their human presence is best and most powerfully extended through story. And if they see that, of course, then it affects everything else that they are and that they do. And so that's kind of my little story, recitation, if you will.
Thank you. Um, and so just expanding from what you said, which leads on to my next question. So, like, when it comes to telling a story, does the story
Huh?
have to come from the original source, or can it come from other people sharing that story?
That's a really great question, actually. I think ultimately, Paolo, it comes from the source, but here's how it happens. Um, um, so that everybody understands, Paolo and I have a very close relationship, and we share some characteristics. So that's a really nice way to move into this. And so if you go to your local food stand or whatever, and you look for the two people that are in front of line, it's going to be Abuelo and Paolo are going to be the first ones that get food. I guarantee you that we will be at the front of that line. So we love food, and that's who we are, and life's great. So if I have a story, it lives in a way from the source. The most powerful version of story is that source story, the story that I tell from my insides, from my gut, if you will. A lot of times we would say it that way, right? Now, if you tell me a story, right, and you tell me one of your stories, and it lives in the area that we share, like one of the characteristics I just mentioned, then that story lives at source as well. In other words, even though it's someone else's story, in a way, you've adopted it. It becomes one of your adopted children. So all of your stories are your children. And the question is, some of them are natural because they happened in your life and you're telling them from that place. The others are so familiar that they're yours anyway. And so that category of story is the strongest, clearly the strongest. A lot of times I talk about the three levels of story, you know that. And so there's the object level, which is the weakest level. And that's just when you see something and tell somebody a story, and there's not, you may not own it, probably don't care. You're just giving it to someone as an object.
Yes.
Then sometimes you get deeper and you start to use a story to persuade or help somebody move. And so I call that the persuading level. And then there's the story of you are the story, where you are an invitation for someone else to step in and be in the story with you. Now, that's where I think story lives, and with that if you're going to engage in story, that's the kind of story that we want to tell, because it's in that moment that you and I are the same thing, that the powerful movement of humanity happens. So of course that's where you want to take everybody and start to show them you can root yourself into this place.
Yes.
And as I say, in my world, a lot of people have been conditioned away or actually told that's not how you should do it. So of course, the minute that somebody does that and they go, wow, everybody paid attention to me. Usually I'm in a meeting and nobody pays attention. And I told one of those stories you told me, wow, everybody paid attention. And that's what helps people see how powerful, this particular position is.
Wow. Thank you for that answer. It was really helpful just to understand that, like, the story doesn't doesn't always have to be told by the original person who went through that story.
No,
It can be told by
no.
other people. Yeah. So, like, when it comes to someone else telling someone else's story, sometimes there's like a mix up in the story. Sometimes they tell it wrong.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
how, like, is, like, I know, like, with media nowadays, a story has come from the original source, it's been told one way, but the media
yeah.
tells it another way because of the way they want to project it. And so
Correct.
if the original source, the person who actually experienced that story, if they go back and look at that story and believe it as true, how do they connect with the real story again?
Well, and remember, we talked about those three levels. So you can always count on the media when they tell a story, that in that world, typically, it's not going to be incredibly rooted. I'm talking about the general media that takes a story from someone else and repeats it, right? So there's some beautiful story, emergence in the social media and in other media places where people are telling their own stories. So I don't want to discount that, but the kind of thing you're talking about is when somebody actually doesn't tell pieces of the story or shifts the story so that it becomes that persuading level. Because almost always the reason the media tells a story is in order to get a particular result. So they're trying to persuade people into, locating somewhere based on the story they tell. Then the next day they tell another one and try to locate them somewhere else. That's what media is about. And so, but that's not what stories itself is about. At the deepest level, story is an invitation to stand in your own authenticity. The media really isn't very interested in authenticity. I don't know if you've noticed that or not. So when somebody has seen a story of theirs become shifted, if you will, because some pieces are left out, it doesn't have the same point, whatever it is, if they simply go back into their own authentic rooting, where that story came from, immediately that story will come right back into, robustness, if you will. It's tangible. If you've lived it or you've embraced it as though it were lived, it's like I tell Buddhist stories and things like that all the time. But when they come out of me, it's almost as though I was there with Buddha. That's how it feels to me. It's that I know it sounds silly. He lived at 500 BC. Clearly, I didn't live 2,500 years ago.
Yeah.
But that story lives in me.
When you're connected to
Yeah.
that story, it lives within you.
Right. So the Buddha stories feel to me like an invitation to stand with Buddha and experience the story.
Yeah.
So of course, then I tell those stories again, and I tell them from that place. Now, do I tell them exactly the same way as Buddha did? Probably not. But on the other hand, they are authentically driven and rooted. So the differences aren't things you and I would get too concerned about. The media, on the other hand, actually is doing that on purpose. They want a story to land a certain way, so they don't really care how it starts. So those are just different activities and different purposes, but they're not authentic either. That's one thing. If you go back to the original storyteller or the story who lived the story and ask him about it and listen to it, you'll feel the authenticity. And if there's a difference between the media story and their story, you're always going to go, well, I can feel it. I know it. It's obvious. The original story is the one. It's the one that's rooted and feels that way. So that's a true. And I think, you point out a really interesting thing. In the world today, people actually don't live from that place of felt experience where they go inside and go, what's authentic? They actually process everything in their head. And of course, that makes them highly available to where the media wants to locate them. Because if you're not rooted in your own authentic self, then your mind can get, maneuvered and managed into any place that someone leaves you. There's it's like a boat the boat that's not tied to shore. The ocean takes it wherever it takes it. And so that's kind of how the media is, right? So.
And yeah, just in that answer, you was talking about how you connected with someone else's story, about you connected with the story, and you felt as if it was kind of your story, kind of. So I'm gonna I'm gonna transition that. So if it's your story, but you don't connect with your story, but you know that you need to connect with your story, but you don't choose to connect with your story, how can you then later on connect back with your original story?
Well, here's the beauty of humanity and consciousness. And remember that sometimes when you talk about this stuff, there's a magic in there, and so you can't explain it. But it's there.
Yeah.
So, So for some reason, and however it is that it happens, story seems to be the bridge from just the essence of who you are. I call that consciousness a lot of times, to the rendering of the story. So that bridge sits there. For whatever reason, that bridge always seems to be available even in the future. So in my life, a lot of stories I tell were stories that were things I never would have used in my early career, in my early life. It just wasn't what it was about. I wasn't particularly authentically connected anyway. I was learning how to do things the way they told me. I really believed that's what I needed to do. And so I think what led me to my spiritual journey was that break between, the authentic me and learning how to be something that wasn't authentic in a different world, which was the corporate world. So like Joseph Campbell talks about the hero's journey.
Yes.
So at some point in time, you go out and go, there's something wrong here. I need to find out what's wrong. And what that is a recapturing of who you are, of that original authentic self. And as that recapturing happens, those old stories are sitting there available for use, because the only way I can explain it is once a story has happened, you can walk back into it at any time. Now, my belief is this is actually more in you're closer to this experience than I am, but I tell this a lot. Remember when you were a child, and I'm talking about 4 or 5 years old, you're just learning how to read. Mom's probably reading you little fairy tales, Good Night Moon or whatever it is. And and I don't know about you, but I really like the the fairies and the goblins and that kind of stuff. I like science fiction, so I like those stories. And so I would go into my room and I would take, a chair and whatever, and I would put a big old blanket over, and I would make this kind of fort, and I would get underneath it, and I would invite everybody in there that I'd been, because as a child, I didn't know the difference between the stories that I was being told and the world I lived in. It all seemed the same to me. And so I would invite all those people in, and, we'd party together, we would talk, and, I'd get to know those folks. And that was my little world. And so as I started to tell us, I found out that most children do that. They go and they find somehow to make these stories come alive when they're really, really young and early on.
Yeah.
And yeah. And I think that's what it is that the most authentic stories actually live that way always. In some way, our human faculties live stories and then place them in a little box inside of us that says, come visit whenever you'd like. We forget the address of where that is, a lot of us, as we've become adults. So a lot of story work is introducing people, giving them the address of how it was when they were 3, 4, and 5 years old and lived inside of story world. And as I say, that sounds really silly to a lot of adults. It sounds almost demeaning, and yet it's our birthright. So it's exactly that. And so some magical way it lives. And you can feel it. You're a storyteller like I am. So when you tell a story and you're telling it from that place, how everybody lines up and comes and lives right with you in the middle of that story. It's almost as though they lived it for you. Yes. And right. So somehow or another, we're able to share that into other experiences. So not only is it magic in our own stories, but it lives, like I say, the Buddha stories feel that way to me. When I tell some of those stories, I tell them as though it happened to me. Obviously, I didn't live any of the Buddha stories, but it sure feels like it over here.
Yeah, definitely, because I really believe in that. Like, even though the story may not come from you, you can always still be a part of that story, or feel that you're inside of that story. Like, even like going back to what you said around being a child and creating those stories. Well, the reason why that happens is when you're a kid, you're not worrying about paying for the electricity bill or the water bill. You just want to go on an adventure and have fun, right? So that's where the original story comes from. You just want to just tell stories, listen to stories all day. And also, a lot of young kids, they like to tell tales, like say, like, I visited a gorilla yesterday and he said hi. Like, I feel that the young generation, like, I wouldn't say me, but let's say my little brother, or just like any kids out there, they're more connected to stories than I would say some adults are. But excluding you because you are connected to your story. But like some adults out there aren't connected to their story because they're worrying about other things. Kids just want to go on an adventure, have fun, tell a story where people say, wow, and that's, yeah, and that's kind of the savory around it. So that whenever my brother wants to tell me a story, all eyes open, because all ears and eyes are open, because, well, really, they tell the best stories ever because they just want to go on adventures.
It's kind of funny. Have you ever noticed, when I was a kid, I always thought adults were boring,
uh,
right?
Same as my sister, because my mum would take her to personal development events and she's like, why is so much old people here? I just want to go home. But then she learned even more. So yeah.
But think about it. But think about it. Do you think the boringness might occur because adults adopt a non-story-like version of engaging? And so here you got this adventurous child who's living in the vibrancy of story with all the nuances. I mean, he's living in a world of color and imagination and emergence and all of that stuff, right? I mean, this is a magical world. And he walks into some event with adults, and all of a sudden they're talking to each other, and there's a PowerPoint presentation with little bullet pieces and all of that. I mean, talk about shooting something dead. You know, you took the best part out of the story and you left the bones. You know, that's kind of the adult world.
Yes.
And it's funny when you tell an adult that, they sit for a minute and they think, Paolo, and they go, holy cow, you're right. Yeah. Right? Even an adult, when you say that to them, like, adults are boring, and adults will stop from, and you say, why? There's nothing exciting happening. I know that. But that world, you know, the way adults have created to deal with each other is largely boring. You know, it is. I'm sorry.
I feel that right now in this world, like I said before, when kids are young, like from the age of 0 to, let's say, 7, they're just in a world of imagination and go on adventures. And like they're not worrying about paying electricity bills or paying for the water bill. But
of course,
when you transition to the adulthood, you worry about a lot of things. Oh, am I gonna lose my house or not? Am I gonna lose my car? Like that, there's a constant fear of losing something. Whereas when you was younger, you didn't care about losing anything because you was just
absolutely
an adventure, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I'd say that when you cross when you cross the border of going through childhood to adulthood, you take on a burden of responsibility, right? But then when you carry that responsibility, well, it's not that we have to let go of our original story and keep hold on to our imaginations. Some people just carry the extra burden of not being able to share their imagination with the world. Because like when you're young, you don't really care what anyone says. You just want to speak. You just want to share your story. You just want to share what you dreamt last night, right?
Yeah, and I think in a way you're highlighting the spiritual journey, right? Because I think the leaving of the story world and the entering of the adult world, how that happens, sets up what happens after that. So, you know, when I'm working with the younger set in the spiritual journey, I'm encouraging them to remember their story world and keep it with them and don't give it up, right? That's what that part is.
Yes.
The adults, most of them have already given it up. So what I'm trying to do is bring them back to it. Yeah. Right? Because in their world, they find that their world is, you know, they can feel, they call it bondage sometimes, or they feel miserable. And what it is that they've left the authentic part of who they are behind. And it's not that you don't adult. It's not that adulting isn't something that we all have to do just to live in the connected world that we live in. It's just, how is that going to be done? How is that going to be held? And so leaving story behind is a little like, you know, wanting to go on a long trip but not putting gas in the tank. And so at some point in time, the car starts to feel like it's missing something. It is gas. So, you know, you've got, so that's right. Right. So the spiritual journey is, the kids that haven't gone out into the desert yet in their car, you're like, make sure you put gas in there and don't forget gas, 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 gas. The other ones, well, they're out in the middle of the desert and they've got an empty tank. And then you come out to them and say, that empty tank you have, it needs gas, 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 gas. So the message is the same. It's just, where are they in the journey? And one set you try to encourage them not to leave it behind. The other set, you're like, we got to go back and get it because you left it behind. And that's kind of the work that you end up doing. And it's really, it's almost silly if you think about it, right? You're teaching people how to be real. And in what way are you teaching them how to be real? In the way they were when they were a child.
Exactly.
Just an adult.
Back to that spot, connecting back
yeah.
to the story. Yeah. And I thank you for saying what you said around the gas analogy. And when we say gas, we mean the gas that fuels the car is stories.
Yeah.
But there's a movie that I watched, and this boy had to keep on telling stories for this car to keep on going. It was kind of like in his magical world, right? So that kind of resembles life. So when I say that you cross from with the spiritual journey, when you cross from the bridge of from a child, in my perspective, from becoming a child into adulthood, well, most of us just get out of the car, leave the gas, leave our stories behind, and then carry an extra burden of responsibility and just worry what we're going to lose every day, instead of thinking, imagine, telling stories. So I'm really thankful that you mentioned that.
Yeah. No, it's kind of funny. I love that movie. I mean, it's almost like, don't you love it when you kind of make up a metaphor and then someone says, "Oh, I saw a movie like that." You're going, "Cool." Yeah. That's awesome, because somebody else used the same metaphor. I love it. Now, metaphor, as you know, is just a short story.
It is a short story. And when it comes to telling a story,
a
lot of the time we tend to it's like when we cross from the spiritual journey from childhood to adulthood, like I said, you take on the burden of responsibility and leave that fuel behind. Storytelling, a lot of the time we try to connect back with that story, but then we get afraid that you cross back over the bridge, so you cross from being back into a child, and you feel that you're kind of lacking behind because there's adults next to you, but you don't want your sense of childhood because you don't want to be different from everyone else. And I think that's a big problem nowadays.
So what I do with that, and you've seen me do this, by the way, so I use what I call props.
Yes.
Right. So I tell a story. I grew up in Southern California in the 60s, as I said. And so in about 1964, we had a big explosion. And what it was called skateboards, right? Skateboards are hugely important. And so I was one of the kids that, would take old skates and take the metal skates off and pound them onto 2x4s that came off a construction lot because they couldn't make skateboards fast enough. So we made our own. Now, they were really bad. You would never want to use them, but that's how desperate we were to get skateboards. It was really a big deal. So for me, that lived in the child story world. I was about 10 or 11 when all of that happened. Well, what I found with adults is you have to, in a way, entice them back into living that place. So I use props. Now, here's my prop. This is a skateboard deck, right? And so I actually, if I do it this way, I think you might be able to read it. But this is a Vans deck. This is one of the clients that I've used. You can imagine how well I do with clients in the skateboard world. I have several of them, and because it's one of my original stories. I really love that. But when I work with executives and people in the corporate world, I have them go find a prop, because I find what that does is it breaks them back, like the physical, when you're holding a skateboard, it's like, well, you don't do that as an adult, right? This is a child. Like the way I love this board, right, is a child thing
Yes.
for me. I mean, I love to skateboard. I grew up loving them. And so when you put this in my hands, all of a sudden the story comes. It's like, oh, of course I know the story of my board. And so, that's what happens. And so it was just fascinating when we'd have executives and we have them use props or go back to places. I remember this one fellow, his grandfather had taught him about soccer, and that was just to him, one of his just most amazing, beautiful stories is being a young guy. So we had these guys go out and tell these stories, these original, what we call original myth stories, a story that's so deep in you that it is you. And so wouldn't you know it, he was from Belgium, and we would have them put it on like a little 3 to 4 minute video. We'd have them tell the story. We'd go find your story, get your prop, practice it till you feel really close, and then tell the story in the video. So here he comes on. He's sitting in his own little town. He's from a little town in Belgium out somewhere. Here he sits in and all of those towns, as you know, have little kind of fountains in the middle. There's a plaza somewhere.
Yes.
So here he sits in the plaza in the fountain. He's got his grandfather on one side of him, and he's got a soccer ball under his arm, and he tells his story about his grandfather and soccer right in the middle of the little town where he grew up. Now, we wept as he told the story about how much he loved his grandfather and soccer and how that was just a beautiful part of him.
And that's how you connect back with your original story, through props.
And
when you
carry the props.
When you carry that prop, you're basically going on a spiritual journey, but you're going backwards. So you go back into the child realm, into the kidhood.
Yeah.
And you remember all the memories around the stories that were told, the stories, the little props that you have. And what happens if you don't get out of the car and just leave it in the childhood realm, you take it with you, right? That's what the prop is for. You take it with you. So I absolutely love that idea.
So, well, and think about it. You and I did that the other day, if you remember. Because you love Legos and I do too. And I did Legos with my son. Now, something you do with your son, I want you to know, when your son's growing up, that becomes part of your own child experience. Because you go back, when you have a child and they're building Legos, you go back into child space with your own kids and you do that, right? So of course, you were sending me pictures and we're asking about, like, where did you get the pieces and where'd you find the plans and how do you the whole Lego conversation. People don't realize, man, when you're a Lego person, this is a big world, man. There's a lot of stuff to talk about here. So you and I connected, and what I'm going to guess, in the future, I've got to believe that Paolo is going to be telling stories about Legos because it figures so. Yeah, you're so in love with it. How could that not be a story? If you had something built out of Legos in your arms, you would tell, that would be an amazing thing, right? And it takes you back there. The minute you see those Legos, the minute you sent me that picture, I'm like, oh wait, let me tell you about what I did with my son, and blah 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 blah. Man, I'd get all excited and everything because it lives in me.
At the edge of their seat when you show them a prop, because it's good enough you telling a story, but it's even better if you have a prop so that the people. The same way you connected to Buddha's story, it's better if you have a prop so you feel as you're part of that story. And
absolutely.
So, leading from that, one of your stories, I love them, and I'd love for you to be able to share that with the audience, the Red Hatchet story.
The Red Hatchet story, okay.
Love this one.
So the Red Hatchet story. Now, I think stories show who you really are, right? In other words, you and I come built a certain way. So you're put together a certain way, I'm put together a certain way. And so these early stories kind of show that off. Now, it's not like you were thinking about it, because as a small child, you're just being it. So that's what makes these stories so powerful. So I'm 8 years old. My father is in college in Utah. And we're getting ready to leave to California because he's graduating. But I'm a newly, what we call a Cub Scout, which is in the scouting world, this very young, first time scout. And you're together with all the guys, and of course, you're young, and so one of the things that as these organizations do, they needed to raise money. So they decided to have us go sell chocolates. Now, at 8 years old, I had zero interest in selling anything. I can tell you that. It wasn't something I would go, oh, wow, let me go sell something. So
yeah.
this wasn't, I was out basically chasing little skeeter bugs in the canals and stealing apples off the local tree or whatever I was doing, but it wasn't selling anything.
It would be weird if you got out of your mother's womb and then you just speak and say, I've got something to sell to you. It's
gosh, yeah. What are you gonna do today? I'm gonna go sell something. That was not what was going on. Not at all. So we go to this meeting, and then they say, "Hey guys, we're gonna sell these chocolates." And I'm like, "Yeah, okay, great." And then they said, "And whoever sells the most will win this red hatchet." And they hold this red hatchet up. Now, in that moment, I want you to know, Paolo, my world changed.
Yeah.
Because I desperately
not sell.
Yeah. It was a red hatchet, dude. I'm telling you. Like you didn't need to tell me what that was. I didn't know. I probably didn't even know how to use it or exactly what it was, but I knew I wanted that one. That was
the one.
That's right, baby. That's for Alan. Alan's going to get that thing. And so, the previous year, the fellow that won had sold about 12 cases, and there were 12 boxes to a case. So he sold about 144 boxes, right? But I was leaving before they were going to give the award out by about a week, and so I saw that hatchet. I wanted it desperately, but I was like, "There's just no way because I'm going to be gone before the contest is over. It's not possible." So, okay. So I went home, and my father, stepfather, made this comment. He says, he said, "I would guess if you could sell enough more that nobody could ever close the gap, that they'd give you that thing."
Mm-hmm.
That's all I needed to hear, friend. It was on. So I was, and this is Provo, Utah. We're in the middle of, like, I don't know, December, January, whatever it is. We're my dad's just graduated mid-year, and we're getting ready to go down to Southern California, and so this is winter, right? So it's I'm in a mountain town. It's kind of sloppy, and it's not the coldest place, but it's not a great place for an 8-year-old to be running around. But there's lots of student housing because it was a university town, which meant people are packed together, and that meant I could hit a lot of doors really quickly selling my chocolates. So I spent the next 3 weeks, and I sold chocolates like a crazy man, and I ended up selling. On the order of about 120 cases, which when you multiply it out is like, 1,400 boxes of these stupid chocolates, right? And so I'm pretty excited because I think I got a really good chance at this thing, So we go to a meeting. It was the night before we left, and we get to this meeting. I'm just 8 years old, right? And so the meeting was forever long because they were going to talk about the chocolate proposition later, but they had to do all the boring adult stuff first, which they did. So I talked about that. So anyway, the moment comes, and it was like, and the scoutmaster gets up and he says, "I want to talk about the contest." He says, "Alan's leaving tomorrow, but he has sold all of these boxes, 1,400 and whatever boxes, and the next person behind him has sold last year's record, 144. This is so bad." He said, "So far ahead, I'm gonna award Alan the hatchet. He's won the contest." Man, the whole world opened up, and then all of a sudden, a voice comes in. The parent, the father of the child who was in second place, said, "Wait a minute." He said, if my son sells enough," he said, "in the next week, he could outsell Alan." Now he would have had to sell. Another 9 times what he had already sold in order, because I'd outdone it by 10 times the previous year. So I wasn't leaving a lot of doubt about how this should look. And of course, my whole world came crashing in because in that moment, because I thought I had it, right? When he said he was going to award it to me, I was like, I took that to the bank. 8-year-old kid. You tell an 8-year-old kid that something's his, man. It's like, that's the deal. So I'm crushed in that moment. I'm just totally crushed. And the scoutmaster got up and he said, I'll tell you what. He said, I agree the contest isn't over, and by the rules, that's how it is. He says, but I'm going to award Alan this hatchet. And he says, and if your son catches him in the next week, I'll buy him a hatchet as well. And so I got awarded the hatchet. Now I'm here to tell you, you know how it is when you're 8 years old and you get that thing, man. That was not leaving my side. I took that thing home. It was in bed with me. I woke up every hour, right, to make sure it was still there. Right. The next day I had to get up, and my dad had this old 53 Pontiac. It was a big old car, and we're packing that thing. My mom and my brother had already gone to California. It was Dad and I were left. And so we had to pack the car and get on the road to California. And so I'm supposed to help him pack the car. And I'm like, wait a minute, we got to put this hatchet in sight. In other words, I'm not packing this, So my dad convinced me that if we put it on on top of the dashboard, the dashboard of the car right on top, that I could see it at all times and we could pack the car. And so we packed the car and we got on the car, and I put that thing in my lap, and it was in my lap all the way to California, except for when I had to go to the bathroom or whatever. My dad had to convince me to leave it in the car so we could have a meal. I was very attached to that hatchet. Now, what is that? What does that show? It just shows how highly motivated this particular person is, for that thing. And that red hatchet was just the thing. So I always see the red hatchet for me as kind of the symbol of a storyteller, right? It's like, if I had that red hatchet today, it would be the hatchet I would give to the next storyteller. I'm telling you, that to me is the symbol. I can go back to that hatchet. I can feel it. I can see it. I know exactly what it looks like. I could describe it to you. I mean, it's almost like it's part of me. And so I think storytellers, when they have that relationship with anything, that the deepest and most rooted stories happen. Yeah. And I think that's why people love that story, because it's so absurd that some kid would go out and do what I did. I mean, I was out and my mother would come out and it would be dark and snowing, and my mother's out hunting me down to put me in the car, and and I no, Mom, I'm still selling, right? Like I got to get that hatchet. I mean, it was just, I was just nuts crazy, and my parents had never seen that before. They're like, "What's wrong?" Like, this kid is.
What's wrong with this?
And, yeah, but that was the moment. The red hatchet story. A great story. It was it became. When I went to write my book, I wrote a book in 2011 called Awakened Leadership. And so I wrote this amazing chapter.
Absolutely.
Sent it to my editor, and she said, no, that's no good. Wrote another one. She said, that's no good. Well, then I got mad. So I wrote the red hatchet story and sent it to her. And she wrote me a note back. She said, every story of your life, write it. That's your voice. Your voice is that. So to me, the red hatchet was that moment of going, oh, my voice is story. I get it. That was that moment of going, oh, okay, got it. And the minute that happened, it probably like you that telling stories is just a part of who you are.
Definitely.
It's like how we're, right? You know that feeling.
Yeah.
So,
I have one question for that story. Like, if I was a chef next to where you lived, and I was driving down the road, and I saw you and your stepdad in a car, and then I pulled over next to your car, and I see this red hatchet on a little boy's leg. Did no one pull you over or something?
Oh, well, it was a different time. This is this is early 1960s. And so, it probably wasn't something that people would pay attention to. I suspect that today, if you were driving down the road with a hatchet on the dashboard, or your child, that might draw some attention. But in the day, I don't think people worried about that as in the same way that they do today. I mean, things change. Yeah. But yeah, you're right. You probably wouldn't want to drive around in your car with a hatchet in your lap. So everybody that hears Please don't go do that.
But it's a great story. And
Yeah.
the reason why I love that story is it's so easy to connect to, even though you
Yeah.
don't have it now, even though you don't have the prop now. It's so,
Yep.
it's wow. It's because it's from you. It's very
Yep.
easy to connect to. You know that it's wow. Yeah. Every time I hear that story, when I even read that story for the first time of reading it, I kept on asking you questions about it. I think you remember,
Yep.
like once you
Yep.
sent me this book, and I saw the red hatchet bit. I kept on asking you questions about it because I
Yep.
absolutely loved that bit. I love all of your stories, but that was definitely the number one
That
that stood out for me.
it's funny too, because you remember you asked me to tell it in a group here
Yeah.
not that long ago. I think it's everybody's favorite story, but do you realize that I had never told it publicly? That was the first, when you asked me, that was the first time I actually told it. I had written it
Oh.
right in the book, but it never dawned on me that I just didn't tell that particular story. I don't know why. People would come up and tell me how great it was and how much they loved it, and I was, oh, thank you. But I never really told it. It was clearly deeply in me, but it never had been told. So that time I told it in front of that group here a few weeks back when you asked for it, and this is the second time I have actually verbally told that story since I wrote it back in 2011. Now, when I wrote it, of course, internally I'm telling the story when I write it, obviously.
Yeah.
But isn't that funny how it was one of the main features? Everybody knows about that story. They make jokes about the red hatchet. I mean, it's all, if the family knows about it, and yet nobody had actually asked me ever to tell it. And so it wasn't one of the stories that I had in circulation that I told a lot, for whatever reason, who knows why. And so that telling that I told that you were in, that was the first time I had ever verbally used that story in a group.
Well, I thank you for doing that because it definitely opened me up. Because if you hadn't shared your Red Hatchet story, I wouldn't have shared my Lego story because you really inspired
Right.
me to. Yeah, so like whenever I hear a story from an adult who tells me a story about their childhood, I love to indulge in and just tell them about my Lego story. And so that was actually the first time I had told my story um, to anyone around Lego. Like I would normally build Lego with people, but I would never tell them around why I love to build Lego, the different pieces that I use. Yeah, yeah. So thank you for reconnecting me back
It's
to my story.
it's hilarious because it's actually the simplicity and almost the silliness of being a child and having those stories
Exactly.
that somehow we're afraid to go back and live that in the adult life. And yet when we do, we feel rooted and powerful and alive and vibrant and all of that stuff. And so it's kind of funny that we've learned not to migrate all of that in, and yet there you go. Who knew? That's how we've been taught. And
Yeah.
so even like with your brother, who's a great financial mind already at age 14,
Yes.
right? So of course I know a lot of financial people, and guess what they do? They leave the planet. They no longer connect the financial stuff to the stories that make the financial stuff. All that financial stuff's connected to a story. So of course you can imagine I'm always telling your brother, don't forget the story.
Yes.
Yeah, don't, all of that financial wisdom you have, don't forget the story. The story is what makes it, and so because that's how financial structure works. It's powerful because of the story behind it.
Mm.
It's just a way of telling a story. That's all financial construction is. It's a way of telling a story. Okay.
Mm.
So yeah.
Oh, thank you so much for letting me have this conversation with you, Abuelo. I've learned so much
You're welcome.
on how to share my story, how that a story doesn't have to be taught from the original source. I've just learned so much that it comes from a story comes from interior, so the inside. And what I love around stories is it's about going on journeys of self discoveries, going on a journey of self discovery. Sorry, and just learning more about yourself, because that, like I said, that was the first time I ever told my Lego story. And so
Yeah.
yeah, you can just see how amazing you are. You help people reconnect back with their story. It's absolutely amazing. Thank you.
You're welcome. In a way, that's the spiritual destination
Mm,
is to see that all stories are available to you. That like my story and your story are actually the same thing in a certain way.
yes, but just in a
So
different
so
scenario, right?
that's right. So it's available, like, you might very well tell someday the Red Hatchet story, or I'll tell the Lego story, and you're going to hear the Lego story in Alan version, or the Red Hatchet story in Paolo version, but it'll be the story that's in our little, it's not my story or your story. It's just it's everyone's story. And so kind of the ending place in the spiritual journey is to recognize that we're all the same thing. It
Yeah.
comes out differently, right? All the leaves of an oak tree, you can tell the difference between each one of them, but they're all on the tree.
Yes.
So they're getting their water from the same place. so
But it's
so our
different.
stories are like, yeah, our stories are like water. It's all in one place, and we can go get it anytime we want. And
Mm,
there it is.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I really love that, because like, just expanding from what you said, like my story is your story, right? So like your story is also Billy's story, right? So when you find, like, you can't just connect with anyone's story, it has to resonate with you in order for you to be able to connect that with that story, and feel that this
Yep.
is this is maybe your story but just in a different scenario, and you're experiencing that story through another body. So I
Yep.
absolutely love that, because there might be another 11-year old kid out there. His name may be James, Jack, Tom, Tim, whatever it is. That's basically my story, but just in a different scenario. Yeah.
And he would tell it in the most beautiful way, right? Because whenever it's authentic, those stories come perfectly, right? So it's always hilarious to watch, because as a storyteller, when a storyteller tells a story and it comes from that place, they got you. You
Exactly.
don't you're not counting how many big words or small words are used, and you're not saying how smart or how dumb is. None of that's going on. You're in that story, babe. You're right there,
Yeah.
and you're in there together. And so it's the absolute delight of being a story yourself and being a storyteller, to recognize that we all get to go in a way. We're inviting everybody back to get under the blanket and invite all of the story people in, and we're all going to do this story work. That's what life can end up being like.
Mm.
um, and the delight. I always talk about skateboarding, how what makes skateboarding different is kind of a sport than any of the others, is that skateboarders will get their nose on the chain link fence and watch their friends do tricks,
Mm.
and they're actually more happy when their friends do tricks when they do. It's like the one sport like that. And storytelling's the same way. When you listen to a story, there is almost more delight when you have someone tell you this amazing story, and because you're one of them, but you get to listen to it and see. So when you tell a story, I get all excited, right? Because you and I have a close relationship, and so, man, my stories pale in comparison to when I get to listen to you tell a story. Because, man, then it's pretty cool. That's my moment, because I'm over at the fence watching Paolo do those skateboard tricks, rooting him on, man. It's more important that you do those tricks, like the uniqueness and creativity in your tricks, man. I just live for that, right? And so it's just a really amazing place to live in this story world. And if we want to, we get to carry it into adulthood. Like there's no reason not to. Put gas in the tank, man.
Yeah, definitely. Put gas in the tank, and that
Yeah.
gas to fuel your car is
Yep.
stories.
Yeah.
Ah, I've had
Story.
an amazing time. I'm sure everyone watching and listening have had an amazing time. But I've had an even better time than them, because I'm speaking to you in person. I get to listen to your Red Hatchet story, and just learning
Yeah.
from the master himself, Abuelo. Absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Yeah.
giving me
Yeah. Well,
this conversation.
remember, it's not me. Remember, it's not me. It just comes through. That's all.
I love that.
So gratitude to consciousness itself for making us storytellers.
Yes.
What a beautiful happenstance.
And just before
Yeah.
we go and we part, I would like you to share a lasting message for anyone who's watching and needs just inspiration to start sharing their story and connecting with their story.
When you look at where we are in humanity, if what you feel like is that you see the separation out there and the way that people don't get along sometimes, and we have a lot of problems and issues in life, the antidote to that is to get rid of the separation so that you and whoever else is out there don't feel like you're different things. The way to do that is through story. If you want somebody to feel connected and close to you, the thing to do is tell a story that invites them to stand in with you. If you do that, you will not feel that separation any longer. So it's likely that if you're listening to this, that your purpose in life, if you want to call it that, the authentic you, is a storyteller, and that you're here to dissolve what look like boundaries and separation, but really don't exist once you tell the story. So create your own life that way. And what happens is the sense of separation and misery and all the rest of it, it goes away because it can't live in a story. You know that when you tell a story and I tell a story, we never feel separate. We're the same thing. That's how it happens. So find your story if you haven't. If you've given it up, go back and start to use it. Live inside that story. It's nourishing. It's beautiful. And when you're doing that, it's just not you. You're living inside of everyone's story and inviting everybody to be with you. And so you become part of what the world is asking to happen. So that would be my message around story.
Every time I listen to you speak, you're like a dragon, a fiery dragon, and like when you roar, we get the message. We learn. Yeah, Abuelo the dragon. That's what I'm gonna be calling you now.
Yeah, I guess that comes natural. I'm not the quiet, shy type. No doubt about that.
No doubt. Oh wow. And before we go, and before we part, I'm not going to add anything to that, by the way, because it was absolutely perfect. But I'm going to add, just going to ask you to share, like your website and like just any products and services that anyone can use, or if they'd like to invest in your products and services, and just look and just see more information about you and what you do.
Yeah, you can go to, it's real simple. Alan, I spell my first name ALAN, so it's alanshelton.com. And when you go to that website, you're going to see the stages of life as I see them in the spiritual journey, as my life was lived. You'll be able to connect to from there to my YouTube channel, which is Awakened Stories, is what the YouTube channel is called. And you'll be able to see if my book is called Awakened Leadership, which, by the way, is a book of stories. It's using stories to reflect what it's like to mature in the corporate and spiritual worlds. I lived in both. And so that's where you'll find anything about me. My Facebook author page is out there, but all of that's on my website. You can just click and find all of that. If you have a spiritual question, I'm not like a lot of people. I don't spend a lot of time trying to sell products or services. I'm I'm simply available to those who want to move in their spiritual journey, and I do a lot of that through story movement. As you know, that's what we just talked about. So probably like a lot of spiritual teachers, I live in availability, and that's what's there. And so if you want to get a hold of me, or you have a question or an inquiry, that's what I live to do. So not so anything about me, go to alanshelton.com and you'll find it. Email address is all that, easy to get a hold of me.
Thank you, Abuelo, aka the Rory
Okay.
Dragon. It's been great having this conversation with
Okay.
you, learning around how to tell a story. It doesn't have to come from the original source to be able to tell that story, how to connect with someone else's story, and just how to cross that bridge of childhood into adulthood, but also take those stories with you along the way. I've learned so much, and I'm sure everyone here has learned even more. Just thank you so much. Yeah, Abuelo,
My pleasure.
the master himself, aka once again the fiery dragon. Thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you.
Yeah, have a wonderful day in paradise, sharing a story with the world.
Okay. See you later.
You too.